I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. If you grew up anything like I did in a house where science fiction was typical dinner table conversation, these words are likely not unfamiliar to you. Those lines are from the Bene Gesserit Litany Against Fear, a sort of prayer recited again and again throughout the Dune saga. I've known those words, or had heard them, or had them floating around somewhere in the back of my head for about as long as I remember. My dad has always been a huge Dune fan, and even when my sisters and I were preoccupied with Star Wars or The Lord of the Rings, his affection for Frank Herbert's Dune permeated my childhood in ways that it's taken me 20 years to figure out. And I think this slow burn, this permeation into every aspect of culture and entertainment and philosophy is the way that Dune has made its name in culture at large. Though many haven't read the book, and some didn't even know the name Dune until posters with Timothée Chalamet's face started popping up everywhere, Dune is woven deeply into the fabric of science fiction and consequently pop culture. And today, I want to explore why that is. What is it about this dense, dry story of a boy named Paul and his little desert planet that has captured the imaginations of generations? How is it that Frank Herbert's little pet project about humans' interference with sand dunes has become a foundation of fantasy? Dune was written by Frank Herbert, a man who, up until the point of Dune's publication, had had relatively minimal success in the realm of science fiction. Since his 8th birthday, when Frank Herbert had declared to his family, "I'm going to be an author," Herbert had pursued that career doggedly. He'd found relative success in journalism, working on newspapers as an editor and oftentimes a photographer. Herbert was a fiercely independent young man, determined to pursue his own passions and forge his own path. And although he had always done pretty well at school, he struggled to fit into their rigid systems. In fact, he dropped out of college because they wouldn't let him design his own class schedule. He married his first wife in 1941 and had a child with her, but he was soon enlisted to go fight in the Second World War. He spent only 6 months overseas and then was honorably discharged due to injury, but during this time his wife divorced him, taking their child with her. But Herbert didn't let this trip him up, and he quickly found work at another newspaper and began taking writing classes at a local university. It was in these classes that he would meet fellow writer Beverly Ann Stewart, who would then go on to become his second wife and the love of his life. Beverly was a force to be reckoned with in her own right, and she deserves a whole video due to the influence that she had in Herbert's life and the creation of Dune, but I won't be able to mention her a lot here for the sake of time. But please rest assured, she was an essential part of Frank Herbert's operations until her death after the publication of Dune. They married in 1946 and had 2 sons together, but Herbert wasn't going to let the responsibilities of raising a family distract him from his writing career. He worked for hours and hours at a time at home on both fiction and nonfiction, and in the beginning he made very little money. Beverly had to give up her own authorial aspirations in order to work full-time in order to support Herbert and the children. In the late 40s and 50s, the Herberts were almost constantly on the move, moving from house to house, at some point living in Mexico, trying to avoid the IRS and child support payments, stuffing the pockets of friends and colleagues with IOU notes. Herbert found moderate success at this point, editing for a lot of different newspapers and pushing a couple of short stories through to magazine publication. In 1955, Herbert even managed to get his first full novel published, a pseudo-sci-fi work following the impact of long stints of submarine travel on the human mind. It had a couple of different titles throughout its publication history, from Under Pressure to, most famously, The Dragon in the Sea, and it received relative critical acclaim, but never managed to achieve commercial success. Herbert was floundering, finding nowhere near the amount of success that he had dreamed of when he was an 8-year-old hoping to be an author. But this lack of success only seemed to make Herbert double down. In 1957, he chartered a plane to fly him over the coastal town of Florence, Oregon, in order to do research for an article he planned to write. The article was going to be titled, "They Stopped the Moving Sands," and it investigated the sand dunes of Florence, which were slowly taking over the town. Local ecologists had taken to planting grass on the dunes, using naturally derived artificial intervention to stop the encroachment of nature. Herbert's article was never completed and was of little interest to publishers anyway, but it planted the seeds for something much larger. There seemed to be something in those sands, in the clash between humanity and nature, in the slow, wave-like motion of those sand dunes, that unlocked something in Herbert's mind. In the early 1960s, he stopped working on newspapers completely, leaving Beverly to support the family as he launched himself into research on a new sci-fi story. This tale would launch Herbert's moving sands thousands of years in the future and across the galaxy to a planet known as Dune. Dune, or Arrakis as it is known by the Imperium, is a fully desert planet with little but moving sands from pole to pole. Though it is a wretched, inhospitable place, Arrakis has found itself at the center of a very thickly tangled web, as it is the only place in the known universe where spice can be found. Spice, also called melange, is a hallucinogenic drug known for extending human life and causing intense vision trances. Spice is not only highly addictive, but it is the lifeblood upon which this new human imperium functions, making space travel possible. Navigators ingest massive amounts of the drug in order to expand their minds and make them capable of doing the intense calculations required for space travel over long distances. Religious and political groups such as the Bene Gesserit witches use the spice to open their minds and extend their abilities in order to have an iron-tight grip over the Imperium's workings. The spice is also central to the function of the mentats, whose use of melange turns them into a sort of computer capable of making superhuman calculations and predictions. Mentats and navigators are very necessary because the far-off, distant future of Dune is one that contains no computers. 10,000 years before the events of Dune, history pivoted in an event known as the Butlerian Jihad. In the Butlerian Jihad, the human masses revolted against the growing threat of intelligent technology, eradicating any computer that could imitate a human mind. This was a brilliant device used by Frank Herbert to keep Dune, as distant and far off as it is, exceedingly grounded. Without the dazzling technology of much of 20th century sci-fi, the society of Dune's Imperium has returned to a feudal state, with families of nobles, by the blessing of the Emperor, ruling over planetary fiefs. Rather than relying on laser guns, though there are some of those, the combat of Dune is largely hand-to-hand. Rather than simply jumping into hyperspace, navigators have to guide ships by hand. Rather than expanding on human technology, the Butlerian Jihad forced humans to expand on themselves, and melange, with its mind-opening capabilities, is key to this. Before the discovery of spice, the desert planet of Arrakis was much like any other planet, slowly being terraformed to support human life. However, upon the discovery of the drug which depended on Dune's delicate ecosystem, all of these changes ground to a halt. Rather than making the planet hospitable for its longtime residents, the Imperium took hold of Arrakis and squeezed, extorting a universe worth of spice out of the desert. Control of Arrakis is the most highly coveted position in the Imperium, aside from the throne of the Emperor himself, which makes it all the more suspicious when the Emperor rips control of Arrakis out of the hands of the savage Harkonnen family, led by their bloodthirsty Baron, and hands it off to his longtime enemies, the Atreides. The descendants of ancient Greek kings, the Atreides are known Imperium-wide for their honor and their courage, something that makes them an automatic threat to the Emperor's throne. The Atreides and their leader, Duke Leto, are painfully aware of the Emperor's suspicions, so when he hands them Arrakis on a silver platter, the most valuable and profitable planet in the known universe, they know that it is probably a trap. Still, they are honor-bound to accept this position, and so the Duke readies his household, including his concubine and son, to make the trip to the planet Dune. It is worth pointing out at this point that this video will contain spoilers for Dune and its sequel, Dune Messiah. If you're just a little bit squeamish about details and you don't want movie spoilers, I will give you specific skip points so that you don't hear the minutia of what happens, and if you don't mind wide thematic swaths, then you can just use that. But if you don't want to know anything about this story going into it, this is your cue to go read the books and then come back here. If you're on the fence, I will say that Dune is one of those stories that, to me, it's impossible to spoil because it spoils itself a little bit, and reading the books or watching the movies after hearing this brief summary will still probably be perfectly enjoyable even if you know what's going on, but you know, watch at your own risk. Anyway, Duke Leto's concubine is Lady Jessica, a member of the Bene Gesserit. She was trained in their ways from a very young age, able to manipulate others with the power of her voice, and able to read people's body language and their actions with near psychic accuracy. She has taught some of these skills to her and Duke Leto's son, Paul Atreides. Paul is only 15 when the events of Dune begin, but he has already been very well taught and trained. He's learned the ways of the Bene Gesserit, he has studied under the family's human-computer mentat, and he has sparred with one of the Imperium's best fighters, Duncan Idaho. However, Paul isn't merely the result of good training. The arrival of the Reverend Mother, one of the leaders of the Order of the Bene Gesserit, confirms this. She tests Paul with what is called the Gom Jabbar, a needle with deadly poison at its tip. She forces Paul to put his hand inside a box, and warns him that if he removes his hand from the box before the test is finished, she will use the Gom Jabbar to kill him instantly. The box, Paul soon learns, causes immense pain, to the point where he feels like the flesh of his hand is being melted down to the bone. The Reverend Mother explains, "You've heard of animals chewing off a leg to escape a trap? There's an animal kind of trick. A human would remain in the trap, endure the pain, feigning death, that he might kill the trapper and remove a threat to his kind. The test of the Gom Jabbar will determine if you're human. We Bene Gesserit sift through people to find the humans." As it turns out, Paul is not only the well-trained son of a duke. He is the result of a centuries-long breeding program overseen by the Bene Gesserit. They have been crossing bloodlines and manipulating bonds in order to produce what they call the Kwisatz Haderach. The Kwisatz Haderach would be their messiah, a male child able to look where the feminine mind could not, to peer back through their genetic memory to unlock untold secrets. He would be powerful and dangerous, and it is essential that, as the Gom Jabbar tests, this messiah be able to control his impulses. When Paul makes it through the Gom Jabbar, when his human intellect is able to overrule his animal impulses, he is the first of the male Kwisatz Haderach candidates to survive the test. But despite passing, the Reverend Mother is still suspicious of Paul. His mother, the Lady Jessica, was not intended to birth the Kwisatz Haderach. Rather, she was supposed to give birth to a girl, one who could be crossbred in order to produce him. Out of love for Duke Leto, though, Jessica gave him the son that he wanted, and that created Paul, the boy who may or may not be their chosen one. The Reverend Mother departs, and Jessica and Paul are left wondering and knowing that Paul may be destined for dark and terrible things. The Atreides family leaves their homeworld for Dune, and at this point, an unstoppable clock is set in motion. Arrakis is truly the center of the Imperium, the most volatile and important place, and that is for more reasons than political. Arrakis is a powder keg ready to blow, and that is in large part due to its native inhabitants, the Fremen. The Fremen are elite warriors, their bodies and minds bolstered by the constant inundation of spice, which surrounds them in their home in the deep desert of Arrakis. They have managed to make the most inhospitable place in the universe their home, crafting technology like still suits, which recycles the body's moisture, and adapting themselves to their desert planet. They dwell in underground caves, only daring the open sands in the relatively cool nights. The Fremen's existence revolves entirely around water, their most precious and limited resource. They drain corpses of all of their moisture after death in order to recycle the water. They see tears as a rare gift, and they think of a surplus of water as greater than any power or wealth. This need for water, this constant push and pull battle between the Fremen and their environment, is epitomized in their relationship with Dune's most unique characteristic, its massive sandworms. The worms of Dune are its most dominant, top of the food chain species. They grow over 1,000 feet or 400 meters in length, and they are large enough with sharp enough teeth to swallow anything, humans and machines alike. Insert the Dune 2 popcorn bucket here for visual reference. They're attracted to any rhythmic noises, so the constant thumping of the mining machines calls them in like moths to a flame. Miners have had to adapt to this danger, always ready to be airlifted to safety when a worm inevitably comes racing through the sands for them. The Fremen have learned not only to coexist with the worms, but to revere them. They call the worms the Makers, or Shai Hulud, which in their language means the old man of the desert. They seem to have an innate understanding of the relationship between the worms and the delicate ecosystem of Dune. The worms, deadly afraid of any water, and the planet, made desert by the worms. One Fremen prayer reads, "Bless the Maker and his water. Bless the coming and going of him. May his passage cleanse the world. May he keep the world for his people." The Fremen's religious devotion is not only for Shai Hulud, the sandworm, but also for a messiah, who they believe is soon coming. They call him the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world, and they believe that he and his mother will come from a distant planet and lead the Fremen to paradise. The Fremen, with their years of elite combat training, their hatred for the Imperium and its cruelty, and their desperate need for a savior, are about ready to boil over by the time that the evil Harkonnens leave and the noble Atreides arrive. Duke Leto recognizes the perilous position they've been put in, the danger that they're in by being upon Arrakis, and he decides to make the best out of it. Our supremacy on Caladan, the Duke said, depended on sea and air power. Here we must develop something I choose to call desert power. This desert power involves sending his best fighter, Duncan Idaho, out to make an alliance with the Fremen. The Harkonnens wasted personnel, gear, and energy trying to eradicate Arrakis' native inhabitants, but Duke Leto sees them as valuable potential allies. Paul and Jessica are likewise keenly aware of the situation that they've been put into. The Fremen look at Paul and Jessica and they see their Lisan al-Gaib, their voice from the outer world, and this is no accident. It's revealed that part of the Bene Gesserit's multifaceted socio-political influence involves going to planets and seeding myths and religion. Decades or centuries before, a member of the Bene Gesserit came to Dune and planted the myth of the Lisan al-Gaib. It's an inevitability that the high-born, highly perceptive Paul and Jessica appear to be the fulfillment of all of the Fremen's religious beliefs. They were always supposed to. Jessica thought about the prophecy. A Bene Gesserit of the Missionaria Protectiva dropped here long centuries ago. Long dead, no doubt, but her purpose accomplished. The protective legends implanted in these people against the day of a Bene Gesserit's need. Well, that day had come. Before the Atreides can begin to work their magic on Arrakis, the trap carefully laid by the Emperor and the Harkonnens snaps closed. Aided by a traitor in the Atreides house, the Harkonnens launch a late-night ambush on the Atreides, obliterating their armies and reclaiming Arrakis as their own. The Duke Leto is killed, but Jessica and Paul, under the protection of the Bene Gesserit, are dropped in the desert to die. This attack has been secretly aided by the Emperor, who wanted to nip the Atreides' growing power and influence in the bud. And now, with the Harkonnens back in the seat of power, the Imperium is determined to grip Arrakis harder than ever before, exterminating the Fremen entirely. However, not all goes according to their plans within plans. Jessica and Paul, with the help of their training, survive in the desert and are taken in by a Fremen tribe. There, they carefully adopt the ways of the Fremen, learning the Fremen's skills and teaching them their own. They rename Paul Muad'Dib, their name for the little desert mouse. Muad'Dib is well equipped to survive in the desert on his own, his large ears collecting the morning dew to be drunk, and Paul Muad'Dib likewise takes to the desert like it's his home. However, he's finding himself growing in more ways than one. It turns out that Paul has a sensitivity to the spice. Suddenly, finding himself in the deep desert where the spice is everywhere, in the fabric, in the food, in the very air, what was once relegated to dreams with occasional flashes of the future has become full-on predictive vision trances. Paul's mind, the mind of the Kwisatz Haderach, the Lisan al-Gaib, expands far beyond human capacity, giving him knowledge of every possible future outcome. Without even the safety valve of dreaming, he focused his prescient awareness, seeing it as a computation of most probable futures, but with something more, an edge of mystery, as though his mind dipped into some timeless stratum and sampled the winds of the future. Paul sees clearly the path he has begun to take. If he continues, Muad'Dib will step into the role of the Lisan al-Gaib, of the Fremen's messiah, and the results would be terrible. Under his rulership, they would launch a holy war against the Imperium, with Paul sitting over them like a god. The universe would become awash with blood, and the Atreides flag would be hanging over the carnage. Knowing how the clockwork had been set in motion made no difference. He could look to his own past and see the start of it, the training, the sharpening of talents, the refined pressures of sophisticated disciplines, and lastly, the heavy intake of spice. And he could look ahead, the most terrifying direction, to see where it all pointed. I'm a monster, he thought. A freak. However, Paul's prescience gives him some delusions of control. He believes that he may be able to choose the right path, that he can step into his role as the chosen one and redirect them away from the upcoming jihad. It is a delicate tightrope walk, and one he desperately fears failing. His mother, Jessica, too, experiences an expansion of her mind. She undergoes a ceremony that will make her a reverend mother, taking in an incredible amount of the spice elixir to open her mind to the memories of every Bene Gesserit that has come before her. She does not account, however, for the infant daughter in her womb, the unborn child of Duke Leto, who was conceived just before his death. When Jessica undergoes the spice trance, her child is dragged along with her. The memories of 1,000 fully grown human lives crammed into her unformed brain. Once she is born, Aliyah, the daughter, is a fully grown adult in an infant's body. She is called an abomination, both revered and feared for her superhuman knowledge and wisdom. 2 years pass on the planet of Dune, and everything is going along its predictable path. Jessica has become a spiritual leader, a reverend mother, teaching the Fremen her Bene Gesserit ways. Paul has found and fallen in love with the woman of his dreams, a Fremen woman named Chani, and gathered a devout following. He realizes that no matter how hard he's tried to avoid it, Paul has become a myth. I cannot do the simplest thing without it becoming a legend. They will mark how I parted from Chani, how I greet Stilgar, every move I make this day. Live or die, it is a legend. I must not die. Then it will be only legend and nothing to stop the jihad. No matter its looming danger, Paul feels that he cannot step from this path, lest the entire universe collapse around him. As long as he remains in control, he thinks, his human will can overpower fate. If he can see the future, then he can choose the correct one. This is your secondary spoiler warning that I will be talking about specific events that will likely be contained in the second Dune movie, so if you don't want that spoiled for you, but you do want to watch the rest of the video, skip to this timestamp. Paul manages to gain the trust and adoration of a lot of Fremen, and he uses this power to reorganize their tribal structure. Rather than taking over as their tribe leader, he convinces the tribe leaders to swear fealty to him as the true Duke of Arrakis. Just like that, Paul manipulates his position as the Fremen's friend, their brother, their messiah, to reorganize their traditional tribal structure and slot them into place in the traditional ducal fiefdom. Paul Muad'Dib wields the Fremen like a knife, striking at the heart of the Harkonnen civilization on Dune. Riding sandworms through the walls of the city, they demolish their defenses and take control. Aliyah, who was kidnapped by the Baron Harkonnen, kills him and Paul Muad'Dib reclaims dukedom of Dune in his father's footsteps. Paul has realized that now, with control of Arrakis, no one can contest his power. He controls the spice now, and if need be, he is not afraid to destroy it. It would take very little intervention to upset Dune's delicate ecosystem to render the spice unharvestable. With this threat at the ready, and a full willingness to follow through on it, no one, not even the Emperor, can stand against him. Paul observes that he who can destroy a thing has the real control of it. The Emperor arrives to settle things, challenging Paul to fight hand-to-hand with the Harkonnen heir Feyd-Rautha. And despite foul play from the Harkonnens and the Emperor, Paul's training kicks in and he manages to kill Feyd-Rautha. The Emperor knows then that there is nothing he can do. Paul offers to marry his daughter, the Princess Irulan, in order to legitimize his claim, and with no other choice, the Emperor accepts, handing the throne of the entire Imperium over to Paul Muad'Dib and his Fremen fighters. It is at this point that Paul realizes he has followed the very path he tried so hard to avoid. He had thought to oppose the jihad within himself, but the jihad would be. His legions would rage out from Arrakis even without him. They needed only the legend he already had become. He had shown them the way, given them mastery even over the guild, which must have the spice to exist. A sense of failure pervaded him. This is the climax, Paul thought. From here the future will open, the clouds part onto a kind of glory. And if I die here, they'll say I sacrificed myself that my spirit might lead them. And if I live, they'll say nothing can oppose Muad'Dib. The book ends with Chani and Jessica discussing what is to become of them. Chani, just like Jessica, has not been permitted to marry her lover because of political reasons. She must remain a concubine. Instead, Paul will marry a princess, the Emperor's daughter, and Chani worries that this will render her insignificant. Jessica, who certainly feels her pain, assures her that the power they've had throughout the story, pulling the strings in their important partners' lives, will never truly dissolve. We, Chani, we who carry the name of concubine, history will call us wives. The themes of Dune are so rich, so layered, that it would be impossible to discuss all of them in one video. I mean, on the one hand, we have the politics of the Imperium. We watch Paul trying to navigate Imperium politics and the tribal politics of the Fremen, trying to fit the old system into the new and mastering both. Dune also dabbles heavily in theories of religion. Most of the major players in the story are not religious in the sense that they truly believe in one faith. Rather, they place their belief in the idea of religion as a tool. Religion, whether or not they believe in it, is a powerful elixir for the human mind. Belief and longing for their Lisan al-Gaib is what makes the Fremen ready for Paul. Love for their desert and the cleansing power of Shai Hulud has long made them enemies of the Imperium, and the heady cocktail of desert desperation, Bene Gesserit influence, and a charismatic leader makes them ripe for exploitation. Dune is also an intense meditation on the limits of human beings and the consequences of great power. Herbert explains that this was one of the main goals of Dune. The story grows from my theory that superheroes are disastrous for humankind. Even if we find a real hero, whatever or whoever that may be, eventually fallible mortals take over the power structure that always comes into being around such a leader. Behind the hero's facade, you will find a human being who makes human mistakes. Enormous problems arise when human mistakes are made on the grand scale available to a superhero. At the heart of all these layered themes, the politics, the faith, the economics, the family, lies one connecting root: ecology. The planet of Dune is on an ecological knife's edge, nearly too hostile to support any human life, and the stragglers who have held on for centuries have made themselves a central part of the planet's ecology. Herbert held a firm belief that Western man inflicts himself upon his environment. The Fremen, however, do not dominate their environment, do not inflict themselves upon it, but work within it. The planetary ecologist of Dune, Liet Kynes, and his father had long been at work amongst the Fremen, helping them to achieve their oldest dream: turning Arrakis into a water-rich paradise. Just as in Florence, Oregon, where they stopped the moving sands, the Fremen have been at work, planting grasses, storing away every drop of moisture that they can find, in the hopes that one day their planet will be able to flourish. Lietkine's father explains that to the working planetologist, his most important tool is human beings. You must cultivate ecological literacy among the people. The planetary ecologists told the Fremen that this dream might be possible, so when high-born, noble, wise Paul Atreides comes along, they are ready to see him as the person that might deliver them. But the ecological themes of Dune run much deeper than just ecology. As the planetary ecologist explains, the highest function of ecology is understanding consequences. Dune is, in essence, about that. I think there are such things as psychological ecology, religious ecology, economic ecology, etc., and none of them can exist in a vacuum. They're all interrelated. So whenever we make decisions and put them into effect, we ought to review and assess all the potential results. The layers of Frank Herbert's Dune, the interwoven themes and concepts, the plans within plans, are central to the function of the story. And yet, as important as that is, that's not what first made people clamor for it back in 1963. Saying Dune was accepted for publication because one editor saw the brilliant collision of ecological and religious themes would be like saying Brian Epstein decided to manage the Beatles because he liked their politics. The themes of Dune mattered later, of course, but not at the beginning. What mattered was the characters. And it was the characters that first got Dune its big break. In 1963, the first third of what would eventually become Dune found itself on the desk of one John W. Campbell. Campbell was, at the time, a giant in the realm of science fiction publication. For years, he had been editor at Astounding, one of the largest sci-fi magazine publications, whose name he had recently changed to Analog Science Fact Science Fiction. Campbell is credited with not only discovering some of the biggest names in mid-century sci-fi, like Isaac Asimov or Robert A. Heinlein, but he also had a firm hand in shaping these stories. His preferences changed the trajectory of Golden Age sci-fi, taking things from character-light, tech-centric romps to glimmering space operas and character-centric sagas. One of Campbell's fascinations was for supermen, and I don't mean the guy in the cape and tights, although he's cool enough. I mean superhuman men. Men that could sweep in and save the day by virtue of being super. And Campbell thought he had one of these characters on his hands when he first encountered the young Paul Atreides. He gleefully wrote back to Herbert, "You are now the father of a 15-year-old Superman." In his acceptance letter of Herbert's story, he didn't mention politics or religion or even ecology. He talked about the characters, about Paul, advising Herbert on how best to shape his 15-year-old Superman. Of course, Campbell would have to, eat his hat about this later, but for now, Herbert was happy to bask in this praise, allowing Dune to slip under the door of old-school sci-fi with permission of its biggest boss. Frank Herbert's Dune World was published in the winter of 1963 to 1964 on the pages of John W. Campbell's Analog. Now, any discussion of John W. Campbell should probably come with a couple of disclaimers. He's a massively controversial figure, widely known for being sexist, anti-Semitic, and racist. Many of the authors that he discovered would later go on to disclaim his influence entirely, but he still was a turning point in the story of Frank Herbert's Dune. Now, if you stuck around for my Dune summary, you might notice that although the story has a lot of the trappings of old school adventure romp Superman sci-fi, these things exist in the narrative largely to be subverted. The point is not that Paul will save the day because he's the chosen one, but that the fact that everybody thinks that's the case puts an awful lot of pressure on somebody who's just kind of a regular guy. Dune's real story fits much better thematically with the emerging new wave of science fiction. New Wave found its footing in the 1960s and prospered in the 1970s and was headed by authors like Joanna Russ, Thomas M. Dish, J.G. Ballard, and Ursula K. Le Guin, among others. New Wave was kind of like the young emo cousin of Golden Age's rollicking sci-fi adventures. They rejected the tenets of figureheads like Campbell Campbell. They looked to inner space rather than outer space, and they dismantled the familiar tropes of supermen and adventures that we would find in traditional sci-fi. Their sci-fi was supposed to be used for serious social commentary, and it provided a fresh and thrilling angle that allowed sci-fi to blossom far beyond its previously established boundaries. Frank Herbert's Dune, while not really technically being new wave, is much closer to new wave than it is to classic science fiction. And yet, Frank Herbert, who was in his 40s at this point and had grown a big bushy beard and was writing about a 15-year-old Superman, had all the trappings of a classic Campbellian sci-fi author. He was able to basically trick Campbell into publishing him in Analog when the themes, concepts, and especially later installments of the story would be very new wave. In his book, The Spice Must Flow, which for the record was an incredible resource for this video, and please check it out because it came out recently and it's very good and says way more than I could possibly fit in this video, Brian Brick calls Herbert a bridge between the older traditions of science fiction writing and the so-called new wave. The only real difference is that Herbert was older than many of the new wavers, and Dune had immense popularity outside of science fiction circles in a way that most science fiction published in the early 1970s never did. Dune had done well on the pages of Analog, but it had yet to receive a full book publication. Herbert's agent had shopped it to multiple publishers, but they all passed up on the opportunity, saying it was too long or too dense. For Dune to be published as a book, it would take the help of the only kind of person that would see the description long and dense and see that as a compliment. A Tolkien fan. Sterling E. Lanier was a huge fan of Tolkien's works, which were also blowing up at this point, and check out the videos that I've done about that if you want to learn more about that. And he was an editor at Chilton Books, known primarily for publishing car repair manuals. He reached out to Herbert's literary agent after reading Dune World on the pages of Analog, knowing that a house that primarily published really long books with convoluted mechanical details, that they would be perfect for publishing Dune. Lanier also saw potential in Dune, after having watched The Lord of the Rings gain massive commercial success. If The Lord of the Rings had found a mainstream audience outside of its very niche genre, perhaps Dune could too. He worked out a deal, and Dune was at last printed as a full, complete novel, something that would be integral to its success. If Lanier hadn't been a fan and hadn't contacted Herbert's agent, none of this would have happened. Dune World and the Prophet of Dune would have been no less or more impactful on the world at large than any other interesting short stories in the pages of science fiction magazines largely forgotten by most of the world. The thing that made Dune grab hold of the culture and never let go was the fact that it became a real book. The growth of Dune into an underground pop culture hit was not instantaneous. It found critical success pretty early, but its seeping into pop culture was much more slow and steady, spreading much like The Lord of the Rings did by word of mouth. The hippie, countercultural beatnik movement was in full swing at this point, and Dune found a happy place on their shelves. It was here that folks began to look past the adventures, past the 15-year-old Superman, into its core themes and concepts. It hit a sharp chord, not only with people who thought that space LSD was cool, but also with a growing wave of environmental concern. The environment and man's impact on it had always been floating around somewhere in the back of Herbert's mind. He grew up primarily outdoors, spending long days out alone exploring the wilderness of Washington state. His friendship with a Native American man named Henry Martin gave him a great respect for nature and a keen awareness of the way that mankind affects the natural world. Still, Herbert was far from a lifelong ecological expert. Frank Herbert had a bit of a tendency to mythicalize himself. He noted that a man must recognize the myth he's living in, and he certainly recognized the myth that was weaving around him as Dune picked up steam. His true pursuit into ecological exploration didn't really begin until he began thinking about halting the moving sands of Florence, Oregon in 1957. It was at this point that he began to embody the beatnik professor look that would characterize him, along with the big bushy beard, And that was only because there was going to be a European reprint of his book, The Dragon in the Sea. His publishers explained that for his author photo for the back cover, European audiences expected authors to have beards. So he began growing out his beard in preparation for that. As Ryan Britt explains, Frank Herbert started pretending to be Frank Herbert right before he had the first imaginative spark that became the fire that lit up Dune. Herbert wasn't necessarily an eco-obsessed beatnik while he was writing Dune, but because that was what the public expected of him, that was what he became. And I don't want this to sound like I'm calling him like a fraud or anything. I am the first to admit that if you are going to be perceived by the public, you need to craft a public persona. Besides, people do change, and he dedicated a lot of his post-Dune efforts to educating people about environmental concerns. It's just to point out that Dune's reputation as an intellectual tour de force on ecological activism is something that it gained later in its life, as it accelerated in popularity throughout the 60s and 70s. It was just as Dune was beginning to gain a reputation that its sequel, Dune Messiah, hit bookshelves. And it was bad. Yeah, Dune Messiah was generally disliked, and the Harvard Lampoon called it the disappointment of the year. Dune Messiah is a fascinating novel, because rather than standing on its own, it pretty much just finishes off the events that were begun in Dune. Skip to this timestamp if you want to avoid spoilers, but we return to Arrakis 12 years after the events of Dune. Just as Paul dreaded, his jihad swept through the universe, Fremen warriors spilling blood on every planet in the Imperium. 61 billion lives have been lost, all in an effort to twist the universe around Paul Muad'Dib's finger. Arrakis has become a site of pilgrimage, and Muad'Dib, his mother, and his sister are all worshipped as gods. And Paul has become disenchanted with the whole thing. How did I set this in motion? He asked himself. It had, of course, set itself in motion. It was in the genes which might labor for centuries to achieve this brief spasm. What was it the pilgrims really sought? Paul wondered. They said they came to a holy place, but they must know that the universe contained no Eden source, no two-pile for the soul. They called Arrakis the place of the unknown, where all mysteries were explained. This was a link between their universe and the next. And the frightening thing was that they appeared to go away satisfied. What do they find here? Paul asked himself. The other political powers, such as the Bene Gesserit, the Navigators, Paul's wife Irulan, and the face-dancing Tleilaxu, are conspiring to take Paul down, but it seems like a fruitless effort. To make a long story short, Paul comes to the conclusion that there is only one narrow path that he and humanity can take in order to come out of these events alive. And this path is going to require immense sacrifice from Paul. He must make himself a villain, the figurehead of a genocide, a wrathful god. He has to lose his eyesight in a bomb strike, and his lover, Chani, must die while giving birth to their children. It is a grim and foul path, but it's the only way that Paul sees forward, no matter how much he despises it. From the moment the jihad had chosen him, he had felt himself hemmed in by the forces of a multitude. Their fixed purposes demanded and controlled his course. Any delusions of free will he harbored now must be merely the prisoner rattling his cage. His curse lay in the fact that he saw the cage. He saw it. In the end, Paul sets up Alia, his sister, and his children to rule over his empire, ensures that the Fremen will remain loyal to them, and then he wanders off into the desert to die alone. He will not be found, a Fremen leader said. Yet all men will find him. The desert takes him and deifies him. His sister observes that Paul's lonely death is his last act of defiance, his last act of free will. Paul's entire life was a struggle to escape his jihad and its deification. At last, he's free of it. He chose this. Understandably, John W. Campbell was not particularly thrilled when the pages of Dune Messiah came across his desk. Herbert had entirely dismantled his precious Superman, showing how all of it is a sham, how even a Kwisatz Haderach must fundamentally be human. The most important thing to me about Dune Messiah is that it sets in stone the themes that Dune merely suggested. If you have a conversation with anyone about political interpretations of the first Dune, those interpretations are all over the place. But if you bring up Dune Messiah, it's a checkmate. Messiah blatantly says that our obsession with the hero's journey might be horrible and possibly destructive. The funny thing about Messiah's less than stellar reception in 1965 is that it means that the book worked. It was supposed to set people on edge, to make them see the tropes and the constructions from the first novel in an entirely different light. It was meant to take people like John Campbell by the throat and say, look what you've done. Although the serialized version of Messiah wasn't published in John Campbell's analog, it found its home in a different magazine, and the 70s ended up being a great decade for Dune. The story was everywhere, being used as a textbook for courses on college campuses. Every aspect of its religion, politics, and ecology being picked apart and studied. The film rights for a screen adaptation of Dune were a pretty hot commodity, passing from hand to hand throughout the decade. One of the most famous attempts was in 1974 with avant-garde director Alejandro Jodorowsky. Jodorowsky's treatment of the story has gained a sort of legendary reputation as of late, but it's likely that his adaptation of Dune would have been a mess. After 2 years of pre-production, they were eating through their pretty small budget, and the script was allegedly 14 hours long. As a Lord of the Rings fan, that's something that even I cannot comprehend. This adaptation never came to pass, but as with other attempts to create a Dune movie, this would spark the fire for other classic sci-fi movies, such as Ridley Scott's Alien. The popularity of Dune in the 70s would also give birth to a much larger beast, the 1977 instant classic Star Wars. Star Wars shares some frankly shocking similarities with Dune, to the point where I'd probably have to do a full video to cover them all. And on second thought, I will do that video eventually. You have the desert planet, the teenage Superman chosen one, the order of mysterious magic users. Star Wars even has a drug that they call spice. And although some people would call Star Wars a ripoff of Dune, it's probably more accurately termed as an homage. Star Wars pulls from a lot of different sci-fi sources, and in terms of what makes Dune actually special, there's really only superficial similarities with Star Wars. Still, its parallels to Dune, especially at a time when Dune was seeing mainstream popularity, mean that Dune and Star Wars will forever be intertwined. Ryan Britt observes that the greatest 20th century film version of Dune was released in 1977, and it was called Star Wars. Dune will always be compared to Star Wars, even if Dune is the original Star Wars. Dune's mainstream success in the 70s was largely aided by the publication of the third installment in the series, Children of Dune. I won't summarize the whole book for the sake of myself, who needs to edit this entire video tomorrow, but it expands and completes a lot of the plot threads and thematic threads opened in the first 2 books. It explores generational trauma, the insidious nature of power, and lingers more than ever on the idea of ecology. As opposed to Messiah, Children of Dune was an instant hit, selling over 100,000 copies in the first 2 months of its release. And if you haven't read Children of Dune, and you've only read Dune and Dune Messiah, I cannot recommend it enough. Children of Dune, at least at the time of recording this, is my favorite Dune book, and although the story wraps up pretty well in Messiah, it rounds out way better once you add Children of Dune. So this is basically just targeted at my sister because she hasn't read Children of Dune, so go read Children of Dune. These 3 books would cement the reputation of Dune as something that is classic sci-fi and also completely genre-shattering. Frank Herbert would continue the Dune story, going in some frankly bizarre directions, including this, and his son Brian Herbert would go even further after his death, but I'm not going to talk about those because A, I haven't read them, and B, this will be a favor to editing Jess. Dune had an iron grip on pop culture, and the widespread popularity of Dune-adjacent media like Star Wars only accelerated it. It flourished as something that felt underground, but was also very mainstream. In all of pop culture, the most popular, supposedly unpopular thing ever is Dune. This reputation was aided by the fact that, up until now, there has never been a popular, mainstream, widely appreciated film adaptation of Dune. And trust me, that is not for lack of trying. As I said before, in the 70s we had a couple of attempts, but the most infamous effort would come in 1984 with David Lynch. This movie, unlike its predecessors, actually did get made and released, but I'm not really sure if that's a point for it or against it. This adaptation was so convoluted, so bizarre, that even its director, David Lynch, disavows it these days. I'll be honest, I do see why. However, despite all of its weirdness, which is definitely there, the 1984 Dune does have some good things going for it. And I'm not just saying that because the person who's going to be editing this script really enjoys Dune 1984 and would put an angry note here if I didn't. It stars a young Kyle MacLachlan who's great and brings a lot of youth and vigor to the role, and it's more campy, bizarre elements serve to highlight the goofier stuff that is in the original novel. It is worth a watch, even if that's just to see the legendary cat rat. This adaptation, which was both a critical and commercial flop, would only set in stone Dune's reputation as something that was both underground, yet foundational to the science fiction genre. There would be another pretty successful, and as far as I've heard, fairly accurate straight-to-TV Dune adaptation in the early 2000s, but that would never really find commercial mainstream success. It wasn't until Denis Villeneuve's 2021 and 2024 Dune entries that we would see another real, high-budget franchise attempt. And although at the time of this recording, the second one hasn't come out, I'm actually seeing the second one tonight, and I couldn't be more thrilled. Things are looking pretty good. Denis Villeneuve's version captures the more epic, esoteric elements of the original story, and if it continues on the trajectory it's on, this could very well launch a Dune renaissance. And this is certainly a good thing, because Dune is more important today than it has ever been. I mean, today's audiences are primed for dense, long-form sci-fi more than they ever have been before. The Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, Star Wars, and its bajillion spin-offs have prepared us to accept long-form, decade-spanning sagas. And yet, even in those circles, Dune is quite special. Compared to so much of today's rapid-fire, cotton candy entertainment, Dune is a 3-course meal. It's a little tough to chew sometimes comparatively, but it is hugely nutritional. Its firm stance against artificial intelligence make Dune seem more relevant now than it ever was at the time of its writing. Its warnings against the whims of charismatic leaders, its firm stance against artificial intelligence and thinking machines make it more pertinent now than it was at the time of its writing. In an increasingly secular world, Dune reminds us that religion is important, whether or not you believe in it. It's something that humankind will always be drawn back to, time and time again, an irrefutable part of the human experience. As we're seeing more and more the way man inflicts himself upon his environment, works like Dune, which show us the consequences of our actions in blaring technicolor, could not be more relevant. Dune is, in its own special way, nearly perfect science fiction. Isaac Asimov defines science fiction as that branch of literature which deals with the reaction of human beings to changes in science and technology. But in Dune, Herbert reminds us that no matter the changes, no matter how far we reach into the future, no matter what planets we find, human beings will still, regrettably, beautifully, unavoidably be human. He strips away the flashy tech and the neon lights to show the way that history repeats itself, the way that human problems like politics and religion and the dense ecological web between them cannot be shrugged off, they cannot be fled from. The problems of the future are the problems of today, and if we don't learn how to deal with them now, we will face them again and again and again. Man will never become a machine, and we would be very well served in remembering that. Dune matters because somehow, inexplicably, this curious story of a boy and his desert planet has managed to weave itself into every aspect of our pop culture. It acts as a proving ground, a place to test the limits of the human experience, both alien and utterly familiar. We see the patterns of humanity echoing in our past, our present, and our future, pulled together by compelling characters and a world that's just frankly quite fun. As I've been preparing for this video, one of the things that has delighted me the most has been pausing my Dune audiobook in the middle of the workday and saying out loud to my coworkers just some of the strange, esoteric things that happen in these books. Oh, I forgot that these twins turn into their parents and have romantic conversations embodying their parents, I'll muse, or, oh dear, he just put on the worm suit and became God. Without fail, it'll start a conversation, and usually a pretty deep one, whether it's talking about familial generational trauma, or, you know, the delicate balance of ecological systems, or the precise semantics of what it means to be a god. Through its remarkable universality, its combination of gut-wrenching themes and rollicking adventure, Dune has managed to make its way into many of our lives, whether or not we're aware of it. Ryan Britt observes that if Dune does one thing remarkably well, it's that it makes the shape of our lives seem like the opposite of an accident. This is certainly true for me as I look back. Like I said before, my dad has always been a huge Dune fan. He never read it to me when I was a kid because that would be a lot, but his love for it transferred to me by osmosis. He would tell me stories about how he and his childhood friends would put sleeping bags on backwards over their heads and pretend to be sandworms. He was stationed overseas in Iraq when I was a kid, and his postcards and phone calls from the desert left me with a sort of mystic appreciation of it as a far-off ideal. Throughout my life, he's fed me bits and pieces of Dune's complex, interlaced religion and philosophy and ecology. It's not incidental that my name is not just Jess of the Shire, but Jessica. And if you ask my parents, they'll tell you that they got the name from a military landing zone or from the Merchant of Venice, but I will not be convinced. A bit like Paul, the cyclical, beautiful story of Muad'Dib and his Dune planet is written into the patterns of my life, even if I only read the book 25 years after my parents chose the name Jessica for me. Dune will never not matter, because in the very special way that only very good sci-fi is capable of, it uses the absurd, the far off, the bizarre, the future, to show us that humankind will always be humankind. Whether that be a comfort, a dire warning, or both. Boy howdy, I will be doing more Dune videos in the future because I have pages of notes in my hard drive and way more floating around in my head, and it's all gonna have to go somewhere eventually. I'll be spacing it out, of course, with my usual content, Tolkien and storytelling, but, you know, stay tuned for that. Next week, if I don't end up taking a break week, which is kind of up in the air, I will be talking about Tolkien and Dune and hypothesizing on why Tolkien didn't like Dune, so be sure to subscribe if you want to catch that video. I'm gonna give another quick shout out to this book, The Spice Must Flow by Ryan Britt. I just dropped it. It is a beautifully researched, thorough look at Dune's journey through pop culture, and it just came out this year, so it's super up to date. It has interviews with a bunch of really cool people, including Kyle MacLachlan and Timothée Chalamet. So if you learned anything from this video, I swear you will learn way more from this book. Please do check it out. In the comments below, let me know what your experiences have been with Dune, how it's interacted with your life, and if you go see Dune 2 this weekend, please let me know what you think. I'll be sharing my own thoughts, maybe a little bit in the replies to comments here, but I'll also probably do a write-up or a short bonus video on my Patreon. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and check that out in the link in my description. But boy, am I excited. This video has been a long time coming, ever since I put this copy of Dune behind me, which, now that I'm realizing it, this is the 2-year anniversary of my channel, so I guess that's really good too. But getting videos out like this one is a relief, and it's very exciting for me because, you know, this direction of exploring more stories is where I want to take this channel, so I really hope you guys enjoyed this one, even if it's outside of my usual parameters. If you have a second, give this video a like because it really helps me out, and subscribe if you want to stick around for what I'm doing. Thank you all, as always, for joining me, and even if we're talking about Dune, I still feel justified in wishing you a happy, hobbity day.